Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 third annual TDG Symposium. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kanani, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who work, live, play, and help us steward this land, honor, and celebrate this territory. Thank you, Masi Cho. Welcome. My name is Corinne Paul, and I'm the Senior Chemical Management and TDG Advisor at Husky Energy. This is my third year hosting the TDG Symposium for the Husky Energy employees. I really started it as a communication tactic to get our program visible to the different business entities throughout Husky Energy. And then it turned into an information share where we had other Husky presenters present on projects that overlap any kind of transportation of dangerous goods. And now we've morphed it once again. This is with the ability to open it up to open up a portion of our symposium to other TDG counterparts. We invited some industry counterparts from CAP. We invited some from CFA, so that's great. This kind of sharing information and even more importantly, ensuring that we're aware of and we're understanding the same information is so critical when dealing with regulations. I'm very proud of the work I've done with Husky. We had our first half of the symposium yesterday and it went really well. So today I'm hoping for just as much success. Also very proud of the work that we've all done, the people that you see on the agenda there have done with CAP, with CFA, with GPAC. We've got some fabulous Alberta contacts there. And so that is just, you know, it's such a help when you're dealing with this kind of TDG initiatives. So today's agenda, as you can see, is we've got an opening address from Richard Wong. Then we're going to do a safety share by Sam Smith. Doug Horvat from the Alberta TDG is going to come in and give us a regulator update. Adrian Mickelson is going to give us a GPAC overview. GPAC, for those of you who don't know, is a General Policy Advisory Committee. And so they do a lot of work on our behalf. And so you're going to see what they're working on. Then we're going to do, and this part, this panel discussion has been always a part of our normal TDG Symposium at Husky and has always been really well regarded. So we're going to bring it into this so that we can share it with everyone. So it's a panel discussion on some of the more prevalent and, you know, in our face issues that are going on right now. And on the panel, we're going to have Doug Horvat from Alberta TDG, Claudette Fedoric is coming in for representing CAP, Rob Hoffman from the Canadian Fuels Association, Henry Ritters will be representing GPAC, and then Angela Wheeler is here representing Chemscape. If you have any questions, you've seen on the chat board that you're available to write any question you have. If we can, we will be answering them at the time. If not, we'll hold them during this Q&A session. If there are questions that I can answer just via the text in the chat, I will. So today's Microsoft Teams broadcast would not have been possible without the help and support of our Husky AV team. So thank you very much. We've got Justin and Joe on there today helping us out. It hasn't been easy. We all know that going virtual within your company seems to be fairly okay because you pick one platform, but once you try to bring it into all the other companies with the restrictions and whatnot, it does definitely add more challenges. So all the participants are muted. Again, feel free to add those questions in, and then we'll go from there. So to start our session, I'd like to introduce Richard Wong. Richard is the Manager of Operations for the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, better known as CAP for most of us. His role is to lead major regulatory initiatives and advocacy across Western Canada to support competitiveness and enable responsible growth of Canada's upstream oil and natural gas industry. In his role, Richard is also responsible for leading CAP's work on matters related to the transportation of dangerous goods, including the transportation of crude oil and other flammable liquids by both road and rail. Richard represents industry on the TDG GPAC and is the chair of the GPAC subcommittee on classification. Richard has also represented industry on the steering committee for first responder training and the Canadian General Standards Board Committee on the TDG competency-based training and assessment. All topics we'll be talking about today. Richard earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Queen's University. He's a professional engineer and a member of APEGA. Richard, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Corinne. Am I coming through okay? Perfect. So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Corinne, for that kind intro. For those of you who don't know me, as Corinne said, my name is Richard Wong. I'm the Manager of Operations with CAP. That role encompasses a broad range of a lot of different files, but in particular and relevant to today is the work that we have done and continue to do on the transportation of dangerous goods and the work that we continue with Transport Canada. I've been asked here today to provide some opening remarks before we get into the meat of some of the presentations around TDG. And so I thought it might be a good idea just to start with some context setting around the current state of crude by rail in particular, talk a bit about the factors that could influence crude volumes that are being shipped by rail, both in the short and in the medium terms. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes within our industry in the last 10 months, and so I just wanted to give a bit of perspective on kind of where we see things going in the next year or so. Next slide, please. So as all of you know, the last 10 months has really been a time of unprecedented turmoil, not just for the crude oil industry, but really for the economy as a whole. Within our industry, we've seen a collapse in oil prices, certainly in the first part of 2020, owing in part to the Saudi-Russia competition for market share, but then also obviously due to decreased demand associated with petroleum products in light of COVID-19. The graph that's on the slide that you can see in front of you shows Western Canadian crude oil production since January 2019, and you can see the precipitous drop in both price and production in early 2020 as many of our Western Canadian producers announced shut-ins, hoping to await some improvement in economic conditions. The black line there shows the WTI price, I would just note, and the different jurisdictions are broken out by color. In April 2020, we saw production fall by about 17%, and it fell a further 6% in May 2020. And so I guess the key question, and a lot of people have obviously been asking, where do we foresee this production curve moving in the future? And I can be certain of one thing, that no one can really say for sure. The only thing that I think is certain is that our outlooks are very much undoubtedly tied to managing the current health crisis, such that demand for some of those products can begin to recover. Next slide, please. So building on some of the production data from the previous slide, I'd like to highlight just why our outlooks are really tied to improvement, to need to improve in the health space, and in particular in regards to the current state of how things are going in the US. Really, our outlooks are very much tied to the US and the nature of the recovery that's going to happen in that jurisdiction. Many of you are probably aware of this, but for those of you who are not, the majority of our petroleum products, about 75% are actually exported to the US. And so accordingly, US demand for our products is really very much intrinsically linked to our sector's success and the outlook for recovery. The graph on your slide shows total Western Canadian crude oil production in red, and then the yellow hatched area shows the proportion of that production which is exported to the US. For those of you who might be curious, the balance of production generally is used domestically. There's certainly some East Coast production that's exported elsewhere, but by and large, the majority of our crude oil production goes to the US. Next slide, please. Again, I will assume that many of you are going to be familiar with this type of graph, but I wanted to build on some of the information that was in the previous slide and highlight just why we see some of the trends that we see. So this graph shows our total Canadian exports of crude oil broken out by grades of crude. As you can see, heavier grades of crude really comprise the majority of our exports to the US. And this has been the majority of which have really gone to the Midwest market, or PAD 2 for those of you who are familiar, where refiners have really invested significant coking capacity to be able to refine these heavier crude oils. And consequently today, the majority of our pipeline exports go to serve this market. There is also a significant coking capacity on the US Gulf Coast in PAD 3, and many of our Western Canadian producers have been very much anxious to increase market access in that market as well. And I think that's really where crude by rail has come in recent years to kind of fill that gap. Next slide, please. So the graph that you see here represents crude by rail exports from January 2016 onwards to our most recent data, which was I think in September. You can see it broken out by Petroleum Administration for defense districts, or PAD regions. And you can see really the increased focus on exports to the US Gulf Coast in this graph, which we see in the form of that growing blue wedge over time. We see both the proportion and the total volume of crude going to PAD 3 has increased substantially in recent years. It's fair to say these volumes are primarily dominated by heavy oil that's moving to the Gulf Coast. And we've also obviously seen a general increase in rail transport of crude oil due to capacity constraints out of the basin, and increased volumes moving from PAD 2 to PAD 3 as well. And as well as I'm sure all of you know, unlike pipelines, rail can respond a bit more quickly to production changes and help to fill some of those production gaps, which is also why we've seen a fairly significant increase in crude by rail exports over the last 4 years. Next slide, please. So as you can see on this graph, since January 2019, crude by rail export volumes have very closely tracked changes in the WTI-WCS differential. The yellow line on the graph represents the differential itself, whereas the red line represents crude by rail exports. I wasn't exactly sure kind of who all would be attending this session, so I'm not sure who at the degree of familiarity with some of these sort of market access related discussions. So my apologies if this is kind of a refresher material for many of you, but in general, the higher the differential, the more economic it becomes to incur some of those higher rail transportation costs to deliver Western Canadian crude oil to US markets. Based on various company reports from some CAP members, I'm aware that operators have kind of indicated that a differential in the order of about $15 is required in order to support rail. I would just point out that in late May 2020, we do see a bit of a narrowing of the differential and a bit of a deviation from the crude by rail exports. There's a couple different reasons for this, but one potential reason is that Canadian heavy crude itself actually remained relatively attractive in the early stages of the pandemic, in large part due to the high distillate yield, in particular for things like diesel. And so demand for this product didn't fall quite as much as did demand for other products like gasoline in the early stages of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Again, I presume that many of you will know this, but for the sake of completeness, I just wanted to provide a brief discussion around why differentials exist for Western Canadian crude. Obviously, there's two key factors. One is transportation costs, and the second is differences in crude quality. And those two pieces together are the primary reasons for why we see differentials between WTI and WCS, which is Western Canadian Select, representative of sort of Western Canadian crude more generally. Folks are probably aware, but WTI is quoted at the Cushing Crude Oil Trading Hub, which is shown on the map there. And to get to this hub, crudes from Western Canada, like WCS, would incur pipeline transportation costs somewhere on the order of $5.50 to anywhere up to $10 a barrel. As well, and as you can see on the graph, WCS is significantly heavier and also more sour than WTI, so it's more costly to refine as well. As I said earlier, given the higher transportation costs associated with rail, some of our members have kind of indicated that that differential range needs to be on the order of $15 a barrel, really to support rail transportation. Next slide, please. So many of you will have seen this graph, or perhaps a graph like it. Essentially, this graph amalgamates a bunch of different information to show the total pipeline capacity out of Western Canada. That's the red block, overlaid with Western Canadian crude production, which is net of any local demand, as well as crude by rail export data that we get from the Canadian Energy Regulator in yellow. Crude by rail exports, as you can see from the graph, reached record levels at the beginning of 2020 until decreasing rather precipitously, as you can see, following COVID measures which came into effect in March. As you can see, generally, the shortage of pipeline capacity has generally been filled by rail, although, as you can see, the actual level of crude by rail is typically less than the full potential, i.e. there's kind of that white space between where production sits versus where rail exports and pipeline capacity together would represent kind of what can be taken away. There's a number of potential reasons for this difference, but a couple different reasons include sort of variances in the actual differential itself over time. There's a lot of storage effects that aren't represented potentially in this data, and then there's also a time lag, as many of you folks I'm sure are aware, associated with increasing that rail capacity in light of increased demand. Some of you may be curious about that little blip that in the red block at sort of the January 2020 timeframe. That represents when Line 3 came into service on the US side, which represented an increase of about 50 to 70,000 barrels a day of takeaway capacity on pipelines. Next slide, please. So that's kind of, that was a bit of a discussion on the supply side and kind of where and how crude oil is being produced on the demand side, or sorry, on the supply side. We can talk now a bit about the demand side of things. And in particular, given the large proportion of Western Canadian crude that's exported to the US that we talked about previously, really it's no surprise to say that the degree of recovery in that market will really govern how rapidly our Western Canadian crude oil sector recovers, and in turn the demand for crude by rail transportation. We don't forecast internally, but here at CAP, I mean, but this is a forecast that's been issued by the Energy Information Administration out of the US, and it's short-term energy outlook as of November 2020. And essentially the EIA, which is the third-party forecast that we're using for this purpose, is really projecting a steady recovery in US liquid petroleum consumption, so that by the end of 2021, they anticipate that volumes consumed will essentially have recovered to 2019 levels. That said, there's obviously a lot of potential variability and room for error in this type of forecast. And depending on how the COVID health crisis is managed, demand will be obviously expected to change as economic conditions vary and differ. Next slide, please. Likewise, if we take a look at the futures curve, this was a futures curve that was taken on November 19th, so a little bit old now, but still representative. Overall, we see a slight widening in the WTI WCS differential over the same time period for 2021. This could potentially mean that the economics for crude by rail over time become slightly more attractive. And so I guess, I mean, at the end of the day, the differential is expected to widen slightly as light crude prices increase in tandem with the anticipated global recovery. But as with any forecast, it is a forecast. Next slide, please. So summing things up, if we take all of that information together and we kind of take the historical look about sort of what has production looked like from Western Canada, if we do some rough math and kind of try and overlay that and sort of correlate it back to what the potential demand side might look like on the consumption side, We can put all that information together and try and get a rough forecast of what both production and then also crude by rail demand might look like in the near term. So as you can see from the graph, crude by rail volumes based on the forecast are beginning to show some signs of recovery into 2021 as producers begin to reduce those shut-ins and begin to increase some production as well. If there's a slightly wider WTI WCS differential, that would also potentially help to support the economics of rail. Towards the end of 2021, you can see the blip in pipeline capacity. We expect crude by rail volumes to decline somewhat as the Line 3 expansion is anticipated to go into service. Although obviously, as with any forecast, there are multiple different ways that this forecast might play out in 2021 and many variables which may potentially impact it. If, for example, the US recovery doesn't take place as forecasted by the EIA, if the differential differs from the observed futures curve, or if pipeline constraints may arise in the interim. Most recently we've heard about Line 5 and challenges there. Obviously, there can be expected to be some differences in this outlook moving forward. I think the key message is certainly our fortunes are very much tied to recovery on the health side, in particular in the US, and so it'll be important to kind of monitor developments in that space to kind of understand where recovery expectations for our industry may go in the short and then in the medium terms. So with that, that's all that I had. I'm happy to take any questions. Otherwise, I will turn it back to Corinne and let you get back to your agenda.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was excellent. We do have one question. It's a three-part, so I'll read it all, and then if you need me to repeat it, I will. So it says, why is the relationship with the differential? And then it says, who is the customers of the crude by rail, and could it be local?
So the relationship with the differential is actually a bit twofold. So as the differential increases, the economics of crude by rail generally increase as well. But it can actually end up being a bit of a cyclic thing where as there's more demand for the product, then the differential can actually increase, which then sort of has a self-fulfilling effect. Generally, I would say that the relationship is more that the differential drives the economics of crude by rail, and that's why we see correlation in that, although there is a bit of reverse correlation, as I just indicated. In terms of the customers of crude by rail, I mean, it's the primarily those refineries in PADD 3 and PADD 2. In terms of whether it could be local, I mean, there's been lots of discussion about the potential to increase local refining capacity. I think it doesn't necessarily, at the end of the day, as from a consumption perspective, where a lot of the refining is happening in areas where the consumption is happening in the US. And so, the same constraints from a transportation perspective, I suspect, would still remain. Even if we were to refine locally, you'd still need to be able to get those refined products to the end markets where they're being used.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and that was hugely informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we are going to now turn it over to Sam Smith. Sam Smith is an industrial hygienist with Husky Energy. He did our safety share yesterday, and it was so impactful, and everyone really enjoyed it that we asked him to come back and do the safety share for today as well. Take it over, Sam.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Corinne. Like she said, I did give this presentation yesterday. So if you're on the call today and we're here yesterday, I will not be offended if you need to take this time to use the bathroom or refill your coffee or anything like that. And for those of you that are sticking around, I will be giving a short safety share related to dangerous goods transportation. With all the safety standards and regulations involved with transportation of dangerous substances, things can still go wrong. So today I'm going to discuss 3 of the major accidents worldwide over recent years. So with that, the next slide, please. So the first incident that I'm going to be talking about happened on June 13th of this year in the Zhejiang province in China. I'm going to be showing a short video that explains the accident in more detail. So go ahead and show the video, please.
Western China's Zhejiang province, where search and rescue operations continue today after Saturday's tanker truck explosion in the city of Wenling. The death toll now stands at 19, with 172 injured. The huge blast set nearby vehicles on fire and flattened buildings. An official investigation is still ongoing regarding the cause of the explosion. The truck belonged to a company that transports dangerous substances. A search of the company's record showed it was sanctioned on 10 occasions by transport authorities. Between 2014 and 2019, it also faced lawsuits involving 4 traffic accidents. Research workers are monitoring water near the accident site for any environmental hazards. Our reporter Xu Mengqi has more.
A powerful blast that burned down entire factories and shattered more residential buildings. The fuel tanker that caused the accident was in itself blown apart. Overnight, rescue workers brought in drones, search dogs, and live detectors to look for survivors, and more than 20 trapped have been found.
From the aftermath of the explosion, because it had been quite powerful and devastating. You see the road, obviously, the crack is quite wide, and the guardrails, they've all fallen down, and with clear signs of, being burned.
What's challenging about this rescue operation is that quite a big area is affected. There were injured people from collapsed buildings all the way to the crop fields.
By Sunday afternoon, rescue workers have already found all the people reported missing, thanks to cooperative efforts from firefighters, special police forces, as well as volunteers.
Our communication with the emergency response and command center went very well, and all parties worked quite closely.
The 170-plus injured patients are now being treated in 6 local hospitals, with some of the more badly wounded being transferred by helicopters to the provincial capital Hangzhou for better treatment.
There were 2 blasts. When I heard the first one, I was at home, but just when I was running out, the second one happened.
Because the accident was a blast, we have 7 patients whose burns were over 90% of their bodies. Treating burns is a long process, so it won't be like the dangers will just go away in an instant.
For each of the severely and critically ill patients, local authorities say expert teams have worked out individual treatment plans, and they're also conducting further investigations on the cause of the accident. Xu Mengqi, CGTN, Wenling, Zhejiang Province.
So the video explained that
Live news.
شو هو هيدا الصوت؟ يا مشحرة فوت 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 عماد فوت 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 يا ماما.
Good, sorry about that. So the video explained that there was an incident involving a dangerous substance. That dangerous substance was actually liquid petroleum gas carried by a tanker truck on the highway. The explosion in total left 20 dead and 172 others injured. Because this occurred recently, a full investigation has yet to be completed. The video explains the company involved in the accident has had issues in the past with their safety record. This justifies the importance of contractor management and ensures when using vendors to transport product that they understand what they are shipping and have the appropriate levels of controls in place. Next slide, please. Secondly, this incident happened on August 6, 2018 in the town of Bologna, Italy. I'm going to show another short video that actually shows the accident live.
نحن عم نعطيكم هلا الشيء لايف.
Live news.
شو هو هيدا الصوت؟ يا مشحرة فوت 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 عماد فوت 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 يا ماما. إيه يا ماما. Raymond, food, please. Please, food, please. Please. يا مشحرة يا الله.
These were the shocking moments when a catastrophic blast tore through the heart of Lebanon's capital, Beirut.
Sorry about that, everyone.
A collision on a highway in Italy caused an extraordinary blast that killed at least 2 people and left at least 70 others injured. It happened near the city of Bologna. Police say a tanker truck carrying liquefied petroleum gas was involved in a traffic accident. The initial collision caused a fire, but shortly after, the entire truck exploded, sending flames across all lanes of the highway and into the air. It happened on a raised part of the highway, and flames spread to a parking lot below, which caused some cars to explode. The blast created a crater in the road and also caused a nearby bridge to partially collapse. Dozens of people suffered injuries from burns to cuts from shattered glass. Firefighters closed all lanes of the highway in both directions to put out the fire. Italian officials say they will investigate. For InsideEdition.com, I'm Mara Montalbano.
So this incident also involved the LPG tanker truck that exploded, in this case leaving 3 dead along with 67 others injured. As seen in the video, the explosion was the result of a tanker truck colliding with another truck on the highway. It is important to recognize this incident may have been avoided if measures were in place to practice safe driving and fatigue management. So after viewing a couple international incidents, this safety share was actually derived from exploring one event that happened a little closer to home. Despite all the controls that we have in place here in Canada to reduce the risk of catastrophe, we are still not free of serious TDG incidents. Next slide, please. The night of October 5th, 2013, in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, was Canada's most tragic TDD disaster. Unlike Zhejiang and Bologna, that were both the results of LPG road accidents, this was the result of a crude oil fire on railway. The timeline of this incident is complex, but I'm going to do my best to explain in short what happened so you all have a little bit more information. So after its trip, the MMA train was stopped on a downhill slope just outside the town. The procedure in which the brakes were applied were not done correctly, and then the train was left unattended for the night as a different engineer was taking over the following morning. The main locomotive was having issues during travel and was left running overnight. It eventually caught fire while parked outside of town. Emergency responders acted and put out the fire. After consulting with an MMA track foreman, they turned off the electrical breakers on the locomotive. With the electrical breakers off, the air compressor on the locomotive could not supply air to the brakes, and the system slowly began to lose pressure. The brakes could no longer handle the weight of the brakes could no longer hold the train, and it began to roll down the hill, eventually reaching a speed of over 100 kilometers an hour and derailed near the town center. This accident resulted in the death of 47 people while destroying the homes of 2,000 others living near the town center of Lac-Mégantic. So the Canadian Transport Safety Board highlighted some of the contributing factors that led to the Lac-Mégantic disaster, and I'm going to share a few of them here. So next slide, please. Okay, so the image that you're seeing depicts some of the key factors that played a role in the disaster. It is important to understand that the Lac-Mégantic disaster was not a role of one person, act, or organization, but a collection of unresolved or unnoticed issues along with poor safety practices between the railway, the regulators, and the tank car manufacturers. I'm going to quickly expand on a few of these factors now. So if you could pop up the next 2 animations, please. So first of all, the locomotive was not given required maintenance and was actually rushed out of service. It was coated in a material that lacked the required strength and durability. The material failed and allowed oil to leak into the body of the turbocharger, which overheated and it caused the fire. This was the original fires that first responders acted upon that ended up having the breakers being shut off. So if you could pop up the next 3 animations, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the brake test was not done correctly. The test requires that the handbrakes, which are meant to hold the rate of the train when stationary, are tested independently. This test was done while the air brakes were still applied. It did not identify the required amount of handbrakes that needed to be applied to keep the train secure. This meant once the air brakes lost pressure, the handbrakes couldn't handle the weight of the train and it began to roll. This highlights the significance of procedures and proper training of controls. It also sheds light on what might have been complacency in the workplace and the importance of not losing sight on the task at hand. So if you could please pop up the next animation. So on the day of the incident, the Class 111 tank cars met all regulatory requirements, but were built to an older standard and were not equipped with additional safety controls, including a jacket, a full head shield, and thermal protection. These controls may have reduced the amount of product spilled after the derailment and reduced the size of the ensuing explosion and fire. This raises the point on equipment standards. It also begs the question that maybe just because any given piece of equipment meets engineering code and standards, it may not include the highest quality of safety controls to ensure its integrity. So the next 2 animations, please. Lastly, Transport Canada had previously identified MMA as a company with elevated risk, but failed to follow up on ensuring reoccurring problems related to the train securement, training, and track conditions had been effectively analyzed and resolved. This meant that they were not fully aware of any weaknesses in MMA's safety culture, and that MMA were not accountable for any changes. Companies involved with high-risk work should aim to be systematic and in control. This includes a level of defense that involves both internal and external audits. Without the support of regulatory bodies, companies like MMA can't be properly verified, and being systematic and in control becomes an unattainable goal. So next slide, please. So thanks very much. Just to conclude, I hope everyone's learned something new about what can happen if controls aren't in place and are able to reflect on some of these changes, some of these challenges, and see gaps in their own work where changes can be made to make for a better and safer environment in the TDG world. Thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy the remainder of the 3rd annual TDG Symposium.
Thanks very much, Sam. That was great. Sorry for those technical difficulties, but you handled it like a pro. Great job. I'd now like to introduce Doug Horvat. As we mentioned, we're having some restrictions, and he's one of them, so he's going to be dialing in and doing it by phone and moving the slides accordingly. Yesterday it worked, and I'm hoping today it works again. Doug Horvat is the Chief Inspector for the Dangerous Goods and Rail Safety Unit, Compliance and Oversight Section, Carrier and Vehicle Safety Branch for the Province of Alberta. Doug is part of a team of 7 dangerous goods and rail safety inspectors who are responsible for compliance and oversight involving inspection of facilities and carriers that handle, transport, or offer for transport dangerous goods, as well as inspecting provincially regulated railways in Alberta. In addition, they respond to dangerous goods incidents, spills, collisions, rollovers, and derailments, providing expert technical advice to emergency first responders, emergency response teams, and facilities regarding emergency response, remedial measures, and cleanup operations. Thank you for joining us, Doug.
Thank you and good morning. Similar to Sam, I did provide a little bit of information yesterday, some consistent information again. So if you haven't filled up your coffee mug, go ahead. But moving forward, yes, I appreciate whoever my tech staff is. Thank you so much yesterday. We'll be doing something similar here. If you can go ahead with the second slide, the disclaimer. Again, the information we're providing to you guys is everything that we have that's legislative background. Every effort was made to make sure it's accurate. And also part of the presentation here is to give you a better understanding of what we do with dangerous goods and rail safety within Alberta and some of the compliances and violations that we've identified throughout the province in multiple industry groups, be it road, be it rail. Slide number 3, again, some of our responsibilities within dangerous goods and rail safety. We're again delivering the compliance and oversight for the dangerous goods by road and the provincial rail program within Alberta. For those not familiar with the rail portion, any rail site that operates strictly within the province is regulated and has oversight within rail safety. That is our team. We then receive the applications and review it and then issue, it's called the Rail Operating Approval Certificate, and then following the provincial acts. Slide number 4, some of our roles and responsibilities, again, with our inspectors. We are provincial dangerous goods inspectors and also designated as federal dangerous goods inspectors, the MOU that we have with Transport Canada, giving us and providing us that function. We are provincial rail safety officers and peace officers within the province. Yes, we hold quite a few titles. Also, part of our functions is, majority of it is performing site inspections of anyone that handles or transports dangerous goods and manufactures it, as well as those rail sites. We do respond to dangerous goods incidences. Our guys have been trained within hazmat to attend and provide assistance to the first responders, and then also act on behalf of Alberta Transportation when it comes to road-related issues. We also do work side by side with Alberta road enforcement agencies. For some of you that may be familiar, we do work with Calgary City Police, Edmonton, all the community and county municipal bylaw officers, and also the highway DOTs, if you want to call them that. They're now identified as Sheriff Highway Patrol. For those that are interested, we provide them designations as on-highway dangerous goods inspectors. So majority of the road checks that you would see are and that are being performed are performed by designated on-highway dangerous goods inspectors or CVSA inspectors. Slide number 5. Again, some of the acts that we enforce or regulate or monitor and have oversight with, again, is the federal regulation. We have our provincial Dangerous Goods Transportation and Handling Act and Regulation, which allows us provincially and gives us our designations and authorities, but our regulation provincially adopts the federal regulations. So everything that's done federally, we can do provincially by adopting it in full force. On the rail side, it is just that we have our Provincial Railway Act and then our railway regulation and then our industrial railway regulation and heritage. My segue to that is, for anyone that is interested, we will be proceeding. The railway regulation, industrial regulation, and the heritage are all coming up for renewal here within the next 1.5 to 2 years. And we're going to proceed with a regulation review and amendments. And eventually, we will be sending out invitations to stakeholders for those that are interested, providing input in regards to what recommendations or considerations there may be. So if you're interested, reach out to me. I'll be the one coordinating it and leading it moving forward. Slide number 6. It's just a map of our inspectors that we have scattered throughout Alberta. I'll go out as far as Grand Prairie, Lee Batty's out there, Mike Robson's in Lloydminster, Christine Carter's in Vermilion and Red Deer region, Cale Thurston and Scott Essen are out of our Edmonton area. Troy Hassel's out of our Calgary branch, and then Kurt Parks is in our Lethbridge area. The phone numbers there are dedicated to them. If you are within any of those regions, please give them a call. They're the experts in understanding the road and the rail elements of dangerous goods within Alberta. And if you can't get a hold of them, we will have, and shortly here, Alberta Edge, who also helps and guides us along with providing information for us and our behalf. Slide number 7. Some of the topics I'll be just touching on is classification, training, shipping documents, safety marks, means of containment, reporting, and ERAP. Wow, it looks like all the parts within the federal TDG regulation, and you're correct. This is what we look at on a day-to-day basis. This is what our inspectors deal with and would perform inspections on, and looking at each part, depending on your business operation, they would then be verifying these compliance levels. As we move forward, slide number 8, the two main parties within dangerous goods are always the consignor and the carrier. Those are the questions that we always ask is, who are you? And then what functions and roles do you or can you perform? Husky does a little bit of both. For themselves, as a consignor, you do classify the product that you manufacture. You will be packaging it, and eventually Transport Canada, with their language, instead of means of containment, they'll be start calling them packages. But that is everything from a pail, a drum, a tote, and even a highway tank. You're also required to have things marked properly or labeled, i.e. safety marks, and documented. So before anything goes out, you should be generating a shipping document. And then if it's still your responsibilities while on site or reporting any spill. Same thing for a carrier. Their responsibilities once they receive a product or they're ready to ship it, they have a proper shipping document and then are responsible for their means of containment, and then also any reporting that may occur in the event of an incident. Slide number 9. On the classification side, again, for the consignor, responsibilities are classifying the product. All means Husky is very good at classifying. I'm not going to beat it to death. You guys understand what you're dealing with and the products that you have, but anytime you blend or create a new product, you then need to sample it, test it, and verify if it meets any of the UN numbers within Schedule 1 of the TDG rec. Once it is, then you develop your SDS sheet, which is then very useful for our inspectors when we ask those questions, in addition to first responders in the event of an incident, so they could read and understand what the product that they're dealing with. Slide number 11. Some of the solutions and prevent, I guess I have our shipping document non-compliance is, again, within the Schedule 1 is identifying the proper UN number, the shipping name and the class, and the packing group. Slide number 12, Part 3 documentation. Again, the consignor is responsible for preparing the shipping document and making sure that all the information required under Part 3 is recorded. Once it's prepared, then they would then give that shipping document to the carrier. Again, the regulation way back when it was first started was in preparation and to assist first responders and for the movement of transport of dangerous goods. Shipping document was never created to be used as a bill of lading or an invoice of some sort. It was to identify what the product is. And that's usually the most common issue we have with shipping documents is sometimes the drivers are the ones generating the shipping documents, most particularly in the oil field industry when they're at a well site and the driver's all by himself and he's got a piece of paper and he's trying to then generate that document. In essence, it's the wrong way of doing it. It's where we find the most common issues and non-compliance, and normally it would impact the consignor because, again, the way the regulation is worded, it's the consignor's responsibility. Again, Some of the issues that we find on slide number 13, if you want to proceed, is either one, failing to produce a document, missing information on the document, or it's inaccurate. Typically the inaccuracy, again with petroleum crude oil, UN 1267, is that they just write it down in short form and just saying it's crude oil instead of the full name of petroleum crude oil. Is it a minor issue? For some, but in a whole, it is a violation. And those are things that on-road enforcement agencies that we brainwash and program to find violations, they will identify. One of the other issues is just also the 24-hour emergency number and not confusing it with the ERAP number. Slide number 14. Some of the solutions, just ensuring the proper training is obtained on how to prepare a shipping document, ensuring employees know how to fill out your document, continued education, and then if you find any issues, having corrective action. That's imperative. Important then that one starts at corporate level and then trickles down straight down to the employee that's responsible for creating that shipping document. Slide number 15. With all of that, trying to make it simpler, Transport Canada has set up a pilot project, their Sandbox initiative, for developing an electronic TDG shipping document. The goal of the project is simply to look at whether the electronic shipping document can provide the same level of safety to a paper shipping document. The use of the electronic shipping document will help to make it easier to read, simpler to update if there are changes, easier to share in the event of an incident. Our experience, again, from roadside, and you'll see some pictures towards the end, that it's very difficult to approach a vehicle that's been in an accident, either one that's on fire or it's completely demolished, and the fire department can't access the shipping document. Typically, they'll be phoning the carrier. The driver's still available, who's sharing that information via the driver as well. And again, this will help then assist first responders. And most commonly, we've already done it on numerous occasions of asking for that either via email, text. This way it's available on our phones or on a tablet, etc. Slide number 16. This is just an example of what information would be available on a vehicle for this shipping document. The document, and there is a permit that's associated to it. There are conditions assigned within the permit, and some of those conditions are what you see on this slide. There would be a symbol, this E, on 3 sides of the trailer itself or means of containment, usually the left or driver's side and passenger side, and on the rear. There would also be the unit number and then also the 24-hour number associated to that company or shipping document, and then also the placard, the safety mark. There would also be a symbol on the driver's door as well. Slide number 17. Just that's the email link to Transport Canada for their Sandbox project. If Husky is interested, by all means, I promote it. I would support it as well. In Alberta, I believe we have 2 carriers currently that are utilizing or within the pilot project. How it's progressing, I don't have any information for you on there. But again, I would encourage more carriers to get involved along with consignors. This way we have a higher sample rate for that, and then also better understanding the differences and nuances, again, geographically, weather, all those situations would be helpful in understanding if an electronic shipping document is valuable to us, and then also for roadside inspection on how that can proceed. Slide number 18, safety marks. Consignors responsible for ensuring that they have safety marks available to the means of containment before it's head out. The carrier is responsible for making sure it stays on while it's in transport. Slide number 19, common non-compliances that we find. Again, either failing to display safety marks, failing to properly display safety marks, either they're fading or they're illegible, dirty, wintertime. Most commonly, we see them on the side of the road where they're snow covered. Officers do use discretion, but again, they're officers, they're human beings, and sometimes discretion is thrown out the window, and there's a Jekyll and Hyde effect at times. Also, some can be stolen and lost, and then also in regards to removing the safety marks when a package or a means of containment is empty or cleaned of all hazards. Slide number 20, some of the solutions, again, just ensuring that proper training is received for safety marks when applying them, knowing which ones to apply, differences in small and large means for containers. Usually for small means, it's labels, large means, it's placards, and then also knowing when to remove them and knowing how many need to be applied. Slide number 21. Ties all into training. Anyone that handles or offers or is transporting needs to be trained and hold a training certificate, and the employer is responsible for that, or is responsible for training the person or their employee, and then also responsible for issuing a training card. Slide number 22. There has been a temporary certificate issued by Transport Canada allowing people that before March 1st or after March 1st could continue to hold their current training card. If it did expire, they can still utilize it due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the issue of having the inability to have face-to-face training for some of those companies that have that or can only utilize that. But this temporary certificate will not be renewed after January 31st. From talking to industry and partners and even carriers themselves, they've found innovative ways to now proceed with or providing training to their staff. It's important, still good to have, and just again, the renewal not, or the certificate will not be renewed until or after January 31. Slide 23, some of the common issues, again, either not being trained, the training cards not being signed by the employer or the employee. We find it quite often where they'll take the training and then either make up their own training card, the employee himself, and then fail to sign it, or even the employer that signs it. Again, roadside, it impacts the driver and the carrier in that they cannot proceed. It's called out of service, and that it impacts their carrier profile, and also potentially can lead to a ticket. Other aspects of training for the training card itself, we are believers in that train to what you're going to be utilized for and operating. If you're just hauling LPGs, class 2.1, then there's really no need to be trained in explosives or radioactives. Sometimes the cookie cutter training regimes that you find online will try to train you in all classes of dangerous goods when really you should focus on one if that's your primary job. Slide 24. Some of the solutions, again, verifying that the roles and duties are required for each employee, obtaining training that is from a reputable facility, knowing the material that they're going to provide, have a copy of the test that's being utilized, be specific with what you want your employees to be trained in, and then also keep records verifying that they were trained. Slide number 25. There is a competency training, and I believe we have some panel members that were part of that as well. I could probably speak on that as in regards to it, but the competency training is a new standard that was developed, has been published, but it is not law yet until Part 6 of the federal regulation has been amended and put through Gazette. So there is a copy of the standard. The standard is written that, again, it focuses on competencies and making sure that they're trained to the operation or business that they're going to be dealing with. Slide 26, means of containment. It ties into what Sam discussed and brought up. All means of containment need to follow a particular standard, depending on the type of package that it is. And typically, on slide 27, for highway tanks, they're engineered, designed, and manufactured to the B620, or in the United States, CFR 49 standard. They all must be inspected and tested, repaired, modified by a Transport Canada registered facility. We, again, for our inspectors, we deal with and monitor those facilities in Alberta. There's over 300 of them. And their main primary role is that they have to be certified. They have to follow the specific standard itself, and they test and inspect highway tanks and repair them. And they have to document everything that they do as well. On slide 28, highway tanks for roadside, this is the most common information that we look for and verify to see if a tank is a certified tank. Picture on the left is a metal identification plate. I call it the birth certificate of the tank. There's also a paper version of that should be on file. And the picture on the left is the inspection decals. Depending on the style of tank and the type of operation it's being utilized in, there are periodic inspections that need to be performed. For those not familiar, the letters that you see there, the V, K, I, and P, those are acronyms for V is for external inspection, we call it visual. K is a leakage test, I is an internal inspection, and P is for a pressure test. The 06-12, that's the month and the year it was performed. And then the 546, that's the facility that actually did those inspections. So that's the information that needs to be on the tank, and that's the information that our inspectors and roadside officers look for and verify if that tank is in compliance. Slide 29. In addition to their inspection, they also look for hoses as well, ones that are either going to be utilized on the highway tank or hoses that are at a facility and being used for loading and offloading operations. They have to be inspected and tested and certified annually, and then you should have documentation as well verifying that that has been completed. Slide 30, non-spec highway tanks or rail cars, again, they're prohibited for dangerous goods service. Anytime you have a non-standardized means of containment, cannot be used. If they need to be moved with either product or residue on board, highly and strongly recommend you contacting Alberta Edge, in which you can get a verbal inspector's direction, and we would just place some verbal conditions on there, understanding where you want it to go and what you needed to do with that means of containment. And then once you take it or deliver it or to your destination, then it needs to be returned back to standard, either by repairs, modification, inspections, or tests. Slide 31. Some of the non-compliances that we find and roadside, the metal identification plate has missing information, or the tank itself was improperly repaired or modified. For those not familiar, there has been, within the last 2-3 years, if you're familiar with the CVSA program, Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, it's throughout Canada, the United States, and Mexico, but specifically in Canada, Alberta, the Commercial Vehicle or Sheriff Highway Patrol performs those inspections, highway DOTs sometimes they're called. They now have also been trained to perform dangerous goods highway tank CVSA inspections. Our group assists with training them and having them understand the B620 standard, and there's steps and procedures on how to perform a roadside dangerous goods highway tank inspection. And so now they focus on these elements. So everything that I'm bringing up here today is what they review roadside and confirm their compliance with. And one of them here is also on the means of containment and checking for the information. specifically to the metal identification plate is the certification date or expiry of the tank inspection, valves or internal valves or external valves that may be opened or not closed, and then hoses that are either expired, and then improper selection. Again, for selection and use, it's confirming that you're utilizing the proper means of containment for the product that you're transporting. Slide number 32, some of the solutions, again, wow, training again, kind of common theme here is making sure your staff are trained and recognize that they understand their means of containment and the inspection decals, the periodic inspections that are performed, doing spot checks on your site as well, and then ensuring the product is compatible to the means of containment. I don't have pictures here. Maybe the next time if I'm invited again, if you like me that much, I'll provide you some examples of what not to put in a highway tank, i.e. corrosive in an aluminum tank, and what could happen to that highway tank if you do use it going down the side of the road. Slide number 33. Similar to the training, there was a temporary certificate that was issued by Transport Canada allowing an extension of testing and inspecting of means of containment, both for cylinders, small packages, and highway tanks. That, again, will not be renewed beyond January 31. The intent of this certificate was to allow again, was because of COVID-19 and the issue with facilities not having the ability to attend a site to perform an inspection or test. It was more for the facility, not the highway tank owners. And we found that highway tank owners were using this certificate, waving it in the air and saying, look, we're exempt from having our highway tanks inspected and tested. That was not the purpose of this certificate. It was, again, to provide some leniency for the issue of having close contact, but if you're familiar with inspecting highway tanks, no one should be there other than the attester or inspector. So in essence, really it was kind of a false certificate. And again, we've always now and confirmed this with highway tank owners. And for the last 4 or 5 months now, majority of them have now gone ahead and I guess made arrangements with facilities to get their highway tanks inspected. So just be aware of that, especially for your sites if you are familiar with some carriers or contractors that have or still want to continue to use this certificate or exemption. Just make them aware of that. Slide number 34. ERAP updates. What I want to touch on here more for ERAPs is for Husky and also the transition that Husky is going through, just being aware of your ERAP responsibilities, both either as a site operator, either with rail or loading and unloading for trucks, and then also roadside as a carrier responsibilities. Don't be afraid of the term ERAP and the utilization of an ERAP, or the correct term, implementation of an ERAP. The intent of it is to make sure that everyone understands what their responsibilities are, also when to utilize it, when to make the contact, who to contact, and even how to report it. Now there's 2 tiers within the ERAP response. Tier 1 is providing technical advice within that incident remotely, and then also monitoring it remotely. And the second tier is, again, providing technical or emergency response advice, and then also you can monitor it remotely, but in addition, you're now sending your ERAP emergency response resources, your contract hazmat team or your technical advisor as well. Part of the ERAP and what we've found also is the issue of not being familiar with who to contact. The phone numbers on the shipping document, recognizing who the ERAP holder is and then who your ERAP provider is. If you like, we could always do tabletop exercises. Our inspectors are familiar with this element as well. In utilizing the ERAP, there's one part is contacting Alberta Transportation via Alberta Edge, and then the other one is also notifying Canutech. Slide number 35 for emergency reporting, not just a picture. Slide 36, on the federal side, this is the section, we always put it down there because we're obligated to, just identifying, saying this is the section that identifies when a report needs to be made, and this is through the federal regulation. For those that are not aware, on slide 37, we also have within our provincial regulation, reporting of a release. And here we've clearly identified that in the event of an emergency report, or that the local authority needs to be identified and notified. Local authority in Alberta is Alberta Transportation and 911. So we've clearly stated that within our provincial regulation as well, so it's clear for that. Slide 38, again, I think we've discussed this even yesterday, but this is just a table of the classes and the packing groups and the quantity levels for when, if an incident does occur and it exceeds this quantity level, we need to make a report. On slide 39, we just identify that when you do make a report in Alberta, that's the 1-800 number. Utilizing that number in Alberta, also when you make a report, you can also utilize it for just a general TDG question. If you have one, you're uncertain of what the answer may be, use that number. There's compliance officers that are available 24/7 throughout the year, and that can provide you with information. If you need to contact an inspector, don't have their phone number directly, phone this number, and they can direct you to an inspector as well within Alberta. Slide number 40 is just a table we created just to assist industry in having a better understanding of when to make an emergency report, either by telephone, verbal, or if a release or anticipated release is identified, if you need to make it by telephone and to whom, and if there's a theft or if an unlawful interference. Unlawful interference usually occurs sometimes, and we've seen it, I call little brats jumping over a fence and opening valves or turning knobs and dials at an industry or a carrier site and impacting either means of containment or the site itself. We've had situations that way. If you do have an incident, don't feel like you now are put in a blacklist. No, you're just reporting that. So in the event if we do come across it, we can take action with anyone that performed an unlawful interference. On slide 41, again, just some pictures of some release or anticipated releases. Slide 42, dangerous goods release and anticipated release. And then slide 43, some provincial and rail safety. Again, this was just to help you better understand the merging of dangerous goods and rail safety and some of the functions that we perform. We complete audits on rail sites. We ensure safety within that they're properly trained. We have medicals for critical positions. We complete track inspections, crossings, and yard inspections. We perform inspections on locomotives and rail car mover. And we also verify and develop for rail sites their safety management systems and general operating instructions. Slide 44. Again, if you need further information, Alberta Edge is a point of contact. It's easier to get a hold of them sometimes than it is myself with the inspectors because they are readily available. And slide 45 is our dangerous goods contact information. And that's dangerous goods and rail safety in a nutshell, and what we do in Alberta and how it could impact you as well. The end.
Thanks so much, Doug. That was awesome. Again, I appreciate you phoning in. It always makes it a little bit harder, but it worked out well. We do have 4 questions for you. So the first question is, Oh, yeah. The first question is about consignor certification. They state that they hire fluid haulers to go to field sites to transport crude oil and produced water. None of the workers are present. We pick our manager's name to be listed as consignor. Would he bear personal liability for non-compliances committed by those fluid haulers?
Okay, everyone can take a sigh, a big breath, and you're not liable as that person. So the consignor certification was introduced after Le Megantic. What they said is we need to identify, Transport Canada within the regulatory body, they said what other modes, and that being rail, air, marine, and road, what else is required on a shipping document. They took this consignor certification from the air mode and utilized it in just saying that there are still parties responsible, and it's the consignor. Even though Doug Horvat is identified as the consignor representative, Doug Horvat is not going to be coming to trial and representing the consignor. It's just someone that has been identified. Again, that is my opinion within transportation, and if it's Doug Horvat representing Husky, Husky would be the one that we'd be dealing with, not Doug Horvat. Does that help alleviate some stress?
I know it does for me. All right, the next one.
But also the responsibility, again, it goes all back to the training element as well as awareness for the consignor themselves and saying, yes, we fully understand what is being done. And when you're utilizing subcontractors, especially at a well site at 3 o'clock in the morning, at February when it's minus 30, you're not going to have a Husky representative there giving him a shipping document. But what you can do is have a template of a shipping document available to them so that all the driver has to do is, theoretically, again, easy to say, sometimes hard to do, is just record the fluid amount and also the date that's being transported. You should already know what the product is because they're getting it from your wellhead or well site. And so then moving forward, then all they have to do is just make that delivery, right?
Perfect. Thank you very much. So the next one is related to e-manifesting. How are you planning to manage the issues between shippers being used by multiple consignors? The decals required are consignor specific versus carrier specific. Is it possible to have the carriers apply for an equivalency certificate? What do you think?
Yes, and that's part, again, what I encourage is, this is where we need to, it's a 2-year project. From my understanding, it's also lessons learned in trying to get through the headaches here now versus saying, okay, this is now going to be within legislation. Carriers can apply separately. I believe the carrier in Alberta has done that as well in cooperation with the consignor, so they're working together with that. But yes, it would also be the responsibility of the carrier because once the shipping document's generated, then the carrier would be then also transporting it in cooperation with, if it's a carrier with multiple consignors. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. The next one is about safety marks. And the question is, if a rail car arrives at an offload facility and there's a placard missing, who is responsible for ensuring that the placard is replaced on the now empty rail car prior to shipping it back to the loading facility?
The facility that now has received it. Due diligence would also allow, so if you receive a rail car with that missing safety mark and you've identified it in your pre-trip inspection, and if you're going to load it again, you should verify that it has safety marks, and then sending it on its way should have that. So then a receiver would then be verifying that. Courtesy would be to notify the location in which it came from, just informing them that say, hey, did you guys do a post-trip inspection of this rail car? And were there safety marks on there? Again, it's a moment in time inspection. It could have blew away. A little bugger could have came and ripped it off the holder. Anything could have happened, but then once it comes to your site, prior to it departing, you have to verify that. And if there is one missing, you would then have to replace it.
Great, thank you. I've got one last one that just came in, and it says, if a shipper provides a carrier a proper legal TDG shipping document and the carrier chooses to replace it and there are errors made by the trucker, he provides this document the inspection at the road site and is charged, and the charge is based on the trucker's document. Is there any backlash on the shipper if the inspector comes back to the shipper to check up on the issue?
So in those situations, then roadside, we leave that discretion to the officer. We can't modify their decision. We can provide them additional information. For our inspectors, if we were to perform a facility inspection and we verified that a carrier now has modified the shipping document and it wasn't the accurate one as what the consignor provided, we would ask them for the consignor what shipping documents they provided and verify that. So we'd have to do some background on that to verify that the carrier one created their own or a new shipping document with inaccurate information, then we would hold the carrier accountable for that.
Wonderful. This one came through. I'm not really sure what they're in regards to, but it says, are digital copies of TDG acceptable? Lots of drivers show us a picture off their phone. So I'm kind of assuming they're meaning shipping document, but maybe you could just reiterate that that would not be acceptable.
At the moment, the way the regulation is worded for shipping documents, no, you have to have a paper copy. There are companies that have digital, and then they would have to print it off and then produce that to a roadside officer for inspection. But again, with the movement with this e-shipping document, that would help alleviate some of that. And again, the nuances with the e-shipping document is you have to have it available. Either you can produce it on a tablet, phone, or even forward it to the officer, and they would then could read it. The only digital acceptance right now within the regulation is a TDG training card.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Doug. That's all the questions that have come through. I do want to thank you for your dedication and your team's dedication to the safe transportation of dangerous goods in Alberta. You know, your willingness to come to these kind of things 2 days in a row is just absolutely evident in your dedication to your position. And I know we at Husky, and thanks again for mentioning us throughout your presentation, that was awesome. But yeah, I know we at Husky, and I pretty much can speak for a lot of the other CAP members, really do appreciate the help that you guys always give us in clarifying the regulations and ensuring that we're keeping on track. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Excellent. So next we're going to have is Adrian, but I hope everyone doesn't mind, or I hope Adrian doesn't mind, because we're gonna actually take a break, let everyone go out and stretch their legs, grab a coffee, have a bio break, and we will come back at 10:30. So at 10:30, I'll just ask AV if they can just put some music on, maybe go to the next slide and put some music on for the next 8 minutes, and everyone can take a break. And Adrian will have you joining us by phone at 10:30. Thank you very much, everyone. All right, welcome back. I'm just making sure we've got Adrian on the phone. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Adrian Mickelson, and he is, prior to joining Imperial Oil in 2000, Adrian was an engineering consultant working in contaminated sites. His initial role with Imperial Oil was managing contaminated sites in BC. In 2008, he relocated to Calgary and took on emergency management. Shortly after this, TDG was added to his responsibilities in 2010. This including representing CFA, the Canadian Fuels Association, as their representative on GPAC. He was the co-chair of the Emergency Response Task Force that was formed after the Lac-Mégantic issue. He had been involved in many or all of the various GPAC subcommittees, plus being involved in the MAC TDG, which is the Multi-Association Committee TDG committee, and has been with GPAC Deputy Chair for several years and is currently the acting chair. So I will, again, just a reminder for everyone, Adrian had some restrictions and he's joining us by phone. So go ahead, Adrian. You may be muted, no? If we have any issues with Adrian's phone, maybe Henry would be able to take over. Henry, did you want to unmute and maybe give us a comment on that? Hi, Adrian. We just saw a number join the chat. Are you available? Technical difficulties. Henry, how about you? Are you open? Can you unmute yourself and maybe video, open your video as well? I did attend the GPAC meeting. I don't know if I really want to do his slides, but maybe we'll just go to the next slide for now. So I'm just going to give you a quick update for what I know. And again, Henry, if you come on.
Okay, I'm actually now able to join.
Yay,
Sorry,
there's Adrian.
because I received the call. Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Go right ahead, Adrian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I received the call, which buggered up my. I can. Okay, can you hear me or not?
Yes, I can. Go right ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. You can hear me.
Yep, go right ahead. Maybe you can't hear me.
I can hear you, but there's because of the delay, there's a problem.
It'll just be you. I will go on mute and then you can just go right ahead. We're right now at the first slide, which explains what the GPAC is.
Okay, so hopefully people are able to hear me. I'm going to talk about the GPAC and a couple of the things that have really been focused on. But first of all, the purpose of the GPAC is to provide recommendations to Transport Canada for their consideration. So I'm assuming everybody's able to hear this. So the GPAC is comprised of approximately 50 associations, first responders, regulators, transporters, and that includes truck, rail, and air, plus industry. And some of the industries that are represented there includes CAP, CFA, PSAC, Alberta TDG, Calgary Fire are all very active participants, plus many subject matter experts that are on the on this call itself are involved with GPAC. So if we go on to the next slide. So in 2020, a review was undertaken to align subcommittees with different procedures, different branches under TC, TDG Directorate, Subcommittee on Compliance and Response. That was the former Emergency Response Subcommittee. Subcommittee on International Engagement. That was the UN Papers Subcommittee. And there's also a subcommittee on policy and regulatory affairs, which includes now what was the former subcommittee on classification.
Adrian, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. So if I'm hearing two different voices actually, so that's what's a little bit complicated. So the other one was there's two key activities underway, and I'll cover off a little bit of detail. And Doug has already talked about this Part 6 training review, and there was a number of us that are on the call that were part of this, Henry and others. But the overall Part 6 will move to a competency-based standard, a CGSB standard. And so Part 6 will reference that standard when it goes to Canadian Gazette 1. I've included in this document a couple of the links to it. So people can look at it. It's available to be used now. It's anticipated Part 6 to be published in Canadian Gazette 1 in 2021. And implementation will be in late 2022. So we've got a couple of years to put this together. So the other one that's really crucial for a lot of the people online is the client identification database. And there's a requirement for sites that handle dangerous goods to register with Transport Canada into this database. And the anticipated launch of this one is in January 2022 also. So there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of work, but these two are very key activities, and the panel can discuss these in a lot more detail. But if we go on to the next slide. So there's a lot of other activities underway, and some of that was just talked about already, but I just want to make sure people are aware of this. There's Part 8, spill reporting. There's a clarification on when a spill must be reported. There's still some confusion. I think Alberta TDG has done a good job of clarifying their expectations, when it is, when it's not, but there is still some on some parts of it that are not that clear. Those that are involved with rail security plans must be in place, and the steps must be done, and that was required as of August this last year. And then there's has already been going out. I know that Imperial Oil has received a request for a copy of these security plans. Some of these could be site security plans, or they could be the overall larger security plans. The other one that, for everybody that's aware of it, the compliance estimation program. This is one that really looks at what is the issues that they're finding, that aspect. This will fall into the new subcommittee on policy and regulatory affairs. The last GPAC, we got a lot more detail into what inspectors were coming across, and we were asking for this for several years. Part of the reason for that is to better understand what the problems were and how do we correct them. Without knowing that, it's more difficult for companies to put in corrective measures. Also, as Doug talked about, was ERAP guidelines, the need to report. They put out some recent information on that document to clarify when you need to report, that aspect. Doug also spoke about the COVID relaxations on training ending in January. I know Claudette, who will be on this. I'll use her, as well as Angela, their baby, as the crude classification, CAP final recommendations. This will fall under the future subcommittee on policy and regulatory affairs, which is where the UN papers will also go. Then there was also another group, and this is in no particular order, this list that we've been working on, was a GPAC governance committee, and that was the response to a SWOT, that was undertaken a couple of years ago, and that's part of the reason why there's some realignment of that. We also heard from Doug on electronic shipping documents. And the other one that I know others have been involved with are the Canadian Emergency Response to Flammable Liquid Incidents in Transport, the CERFLIT training curriculum. CAP was instrumental on this. A number of us were involved with the development using the BC Justice Institute for the Tier 2s, the Tier 3 training on that. And the list actually just continues. So there's other ones that I would go through several more slides, but I really want to turn this over to the panel for discussion at this point, because I think they can go into a lot more detail on a lot of this stuff. Okay.
Thanks so much, Adrian. I really appreciate it. I know it's hard when you're doing it on the phone and checking it on the web and there's a delay, but I appreciate you coming in and giving us that overview. As Adrian said, we will be doing our panel discussion now. So to start off, I'm going to actually introduce all of our panelists. So the first panelist we have is Rob Hoffman. Rob Hoffman is with the Canadian Fuels Association. He has extensive experience in the downstream petroleum industry, having worked for 30 years with Imperial Oil. In December 2014, Rob joined the Canadian Fuels Association to serve as the Director, Government of Stakeholder Relations for Western Canada. Rob currently serves on the Board of Directors for the Alberta Water Council and the Canadian Brownfields Network, on project teams for Alberta's Clean Air Strategy Alliance, on the National Transcare Committee, which promotes the safe transportation of dangerous goods, on the National WMIS Current Issues Committee as well. The Canadian Fuels Association represents its members, member Canadian companies involved in the refining, distribution, and marketing of petroleum products. The association's work and advocacy emphasize informed environmental health and safety policy development that recognizes the current and future importance of petroleum fuels to Canada's economy and competitiveness and to our collective standard of living. So just to also let you know, Rob is also calling in, so we won't have a video from him. But the next person on our panel is Claudette Fedoruk, and we do have her on video. From the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Claudette has worked in environment, health and safety for over 20 years and actively pursues health and safety strategy, innovation, and best practices that make a difference. She holds a Bachelor of Environmental Science from the University of Calgary, an Occupational Health and Safety Certificate with Distinction from the University of Alberta, and a Master's of Science in Occupational Health from McGill University. She held her CRSP designation, she's held it since 2006, and as an operations policy analyst for the last 10 years with the CAP program, Claudette is responsible for policy and regulatory advocacy and industry initiatives in the upstream oil and gas industry. Transportation of dangerous goods is a key file she's worked on for the past 4 years at CAP in collaboration with Transport Canada and CAP members, particularly with respect to issues around crude by rail, crude classification, and again, like Adrian said, we're going to be talking to Claudette about that crude classification. Next, representing the GPAC, so you have heard from Adrian, but we're also going to, on the panel itself, we're going to have Henry Ritters. Henry Ritters is a certified registered safety professional, an active participating member of the Canadian Society of Safety Engineering, as well as actively working as a safety professional for 31 years in various roles from specialist to manager in both the transportation of oil and gas industry, in both the transportation and the oil and gas industry over the past 40 years. Henry is committed to and has a passion for making industry workplaces safer so that everyone can go home safely each day. Henry is employed by Keyera Corp since 2016 in the capacity of corporate TDG regulatory and logistics advisor. The majority of his responsibilities include providing SME guidance to all Keyera's Canadian and US facilities on transportation and TDG matters, along with developing and monitoring of in-house TDG programs and compliance. A secondary function of his is to support all Keyera's business teams on transportation matters and technical emergency response support for their products. Henry currently serves as chair on the CAP, that's Canadian Associated Petroleum Producers, as we know, TDG committee since 2014, as well as being the CAP representative on the Transport Canada TDG GPAC. Next, we have Angela Wheeler. Angela Wheeler has over 20 years experience in health and safety, starting as a chemist before moving into occupational hygiene. She's a certified industrial hygienist, Canadian registered safety professional, registered SDS author, and program manager at Chemscape. She helps clients implement a standardized chemical management system, assign the appropriate controls, and deliver effective communication to workers. She's honored to have Husky as one of those clients, and we are honored to have her. Thank you. And also joining the panel will also be Doug Horvat, who you met earlier. Okay, so everyone who is muted, please unmute so that we can get this panel going. And again, as I suggested, turn on your video so they don't have to look at me. We're going to start with Henry. We've heard quite a bit about the new standard for training, assessment, and competency. You've been working a lot on this. What are your thoughts about moving forward? And if anything, do you think we need to be concerned about?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. You know, moving forward, I'll say a lot of large organizations already have quite a robust training and competency system in-house. What I see as potentially problematic going forward is the problem with things becoming too prescriptive or sternly enforced, especially on the in the onset of the initial regulatory change when it comes to some of the smaller organizations, the mom and pop trucking companies, the the smaller companies that don't have the in-house resources or expertise, because a lot of the organizations people wear multiple hats, don't necessarily have a lengthy background in regulatory compliance as such, or even the knowledge as such in how to build a training program or how to evaluate training programs. So that'd be one of the first things, is really making sure that when the regulations tentatively change here in 2022, as it's kind of right now sitting for the proposed date, that good guidance material from Transport Canada has, gets put out to industry to help some of the smaller organizations and even larger organizations to make sure that they're compliant with all aspects of what's expected when it comes to competency and evaluating that competency of employees, so that they can meet the new regulatory changes that will come out in Part 6 that will reference the standard. I hope that kind of answers that question.
That's great. Thank you so much. The next part of that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob and Claudette. As association representatives, I know you've sent in remarks on behalf of your members. What are their concerns besides what maybe Henry has touched on? We'll go to Claudette first, and then we'll go to Rob. Claudette, you'll have to unmute as well. Sorry.
I'm trying. My button's not working. Okay, I think
nope, it's working now.
Perfect. Thank you. From an industry perspective, I think the biggest thing that we're seeing with the new CGSB standard on training and competency is the potential impact on cost within organizations and efficiencies. So there's an obvious impact to training. The new process will require new requirements and new processes within organizations as well as across the industry as well. And I think from a CAP perspective, there may be an opportunity to use our Energy Safety Canada, so our safety vehicle, to potentially pull together a train the trainer or some type of other training course to help industry utilize the CGSB standard and implement it more effectively and efficiently within the upstream oil and gas industry. So there is a huge opportunity here. The CGSB standard was just published, and we do have some time before it does become ingrained in regulation. I believe it's 2022. Is that correct, Henry? Yes. Yeah, so it's kind of something that I think we can probably pivot to and look at, but cost and potential efficiencies on how to get this rolled out properly within the upstream oil and gas industry is a key initiative for us moving forward.
That completely makes sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I'll get you to mute your mic, and then we'll head off to Rob, representing the CFA. Do you have any additional concerns from your members?
Hi, Corinne. Thanks. Just want to make sure that you can hear me.
I can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So first, I'd like to start by thanking Husky, you, Corinne, and Sam, and your colleagues for putting together this forum. It's great to get a group of people together who are interested in this, and what really struck me in Sam's presentation is why we need to get this right. Like the examples you gave, Sam, were really striking. So thank you for that. So I'll just touch on a few other things that Henry and Claudette have also touched on. Yeah, we made submissions, Corinne, several of them. The consultations for this have been going on since 2017. So there's been dialogue between Transport Canada and stakeholders for quite some time on this. And I think early on in our consultations, the concerns from our members were, I would say the biggest concern was making sure that large industry like our members and CAP members who have emergency management and safety at the forefront of everything we do still retain the ability to deliver training on their own, of course using the framework and making sure that the competency-based training standard that's been developed is part of that. But early on, there's certainly some worry or possibility that this could become sort of a boilerplate or a template thing that had to be delivered by third-party training organizations. Clearly, Transport Canada heard our concerns, and the way this has turned out is I think going to work for everybody. Smaller organizations, the mom and pops that Henry alluded to, certainly are the ones that are going to need the most assistance from guidance documents and also from external training organizations. But the more sophisticated and larger entities like our members will be able to deliver their own training programs in-house. And really, there's two elements. There's a sort of a 101 or the basic safety training, and then there is function-specific training, which matters for people doing things like loading specialized means of containment, by doing classification and some of the more specialized things that go on. So I would say that was probably our primary concern. I'd also say that it's been more than 20 years since Transport Canada and the TDG regulations have been, the Part 6 at least, have been updated. So it was certainly timely, and in the wake of Lac-Mégantic, all of the TDG regulations received a lot of scrutiny. So we support the broader efforts to bring this up to date, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. I appreciate it. This one is going to actually go back to Claudette. CAP's been working on a TDG compliance for the transportation of crude oil and related products by road and rail. Been working on that for a while. We've changed the name a couple of times. Can you give us a brief synopsis on what it covers, when you expect for it to be published, and just kind of, what we've been working on and where we're at? And you'll have to fiddle with your, there you go.
There you go. Okay, perfect. I'm getting the hang of it now. So thank you for that, Corinne. Yes, CAP has been working on some industry guidance for a long time in response to the Lac-Mégantic incident on the classification of crude oil and its related products. This is in direct response to the requirements currently in Part 2, classification under the Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulation. The CAP guidance document will include more of an overview of crude oil and its related products because of the variable nature of the dangerous goods in question. It talks a little bit about the requirements for sample and testing those dangerous goods, so crude oils of various types and various different configurations as well across different regions. The CAP guidance document also includes an overview of how to set up your sampling and testing programs, more from a goal-based perspective, not prescriptive by any stretch of the imagination. The focus is really on three primary variables. So that's volatility, flammability, and toxicity. So the volatility measurement really looks at the true vapor pressure of crude oil and related projects or related products, and that focuses on more of the light ends that are currently contained in that liquid phase material as well. So that's the consideration there. Flammability looks primarily at initial boiling point and your flash point. The important piece to note with that is the importance of using closed sampling containers to ensure that any potential light ends contained within these samples are contained so that they could be accurately measured in the lab once they're sent off for analysis. And then the third piece is looking at toxicity. So this has been talked about quite a bit. There's been a lot of discussion, probably 5 years worth now that folks on the phone could probably attest with. 5 years of discussion with Transport Canada on the toxicity of crude oil, primarily in relation to hydrogen sulfide and the contents of that within it. The measurement of H2S is pretty refined in the liquid phase. However, we do have issues with measuring hydrogen sulfide in the vapor phase, so the stuff kind of coming off the liquid material. The vapor phase values are the ones that are needed to use the appropriate formula to determine toxicity in accordance with the Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulation under Part 2 classification. CAP has in the background, so it's been 5 years, it's been a little bit of time, but we did work with Chemscape, and I know Angela is on the panel as well, on a research project looking at H2S toxicity, and I'd love to have Angela, if you could pop on and just talk a little bit about that project and the results of that, and then I can kind of continue on the guidance piece. That would be great.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Okay. Yeah, just in a nutshell, everything toxic typically, take away the everything, toxic compounds typically have lethal concentration, an LD50, LC50, and petroleum crude does not. H2S does, it's very low, 800. You understand IDLH as another measure, immediately dangerous to life and health. Well, LD50, LC50, and with regard to H2S will, yeah, that's a lethal dose. So 50% of the people die at a certain concentration, 800 ppm. So whereas the IDLH, that's when our workers get knocked down by H2S. That's closer to 300 or less. So working with those numbers is how you get a toxic substance and put it into our TGG classification. Again, petroleum crude oil does not have one of these measures. I'll say, because over the history it hasn't been that toxic. So we went around using calculations to determine that. We took the most sour crude representative and loaded the modeling results into the equation that is required through classification, and we found that it doesn't meet that criteria. So is that enough? Is that enough detail? I felt like I've gone into too much detail previously, but yeah, that's what we did.
Thanks, Angela. I appreciate that. Yeah, so our findings really show that petroleum crude oil probably will never meet the criteria for toxicity, so the designation of UN 3494, petroleum sour crude oil toxic, in accordance with the TDG regulations. That being said, according to Transport Canada, we can never say never. So we do need sampling data and analysis to further that argument with Transport Canada. But in the interim, we are putting the finishing touches on the guidance document to hopefully clarify the requirements of sampling, testing, and analysis, so that folks could, across the industry, can classify their products properly and in accordance to Part 2. And yeah, we will have more information as we will know more as we sample more and move forward. But in the interim, this guidance should be coming out hopefully in early 2021. I do have it at the with our editor in a final draft. We're just figuring out with the group and with the CAP members on how to articulate the toxicity section appropriately for rollout to the industry. So that's kind of just the last little step needed before the document can be published and released to industry. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
It will be very exciting when that's
It's been a while.
Absolutely. So on that note, though, I know you provided a draft version to Transport Canada for review and comment. Were there any issues that Transport Canada had with our document that may cause some contention going forward? And you were muted again, so.
Yeah, so I spoke to that a little bit. So Transport Canada isn't convinced, basically, that petroleum crude oil could never meet the criteria for UN 3494. So we do have a little bit of work to do as an industry association to support that argument and advocacy from our side. Like I said, in the interim, I think we've got a plan forward on how to move this issue across the industry to get everyone on the same page and classifying the same way with our crude oil and related products. But in the interim, we will be still working with Transport Canada on the side on the issue of toxicity for probably the next, hopefully not 5 years, but the next little bit anyway. Henry or Angela, do you have anything to add to those comments?
I'm with Corinne. I'm excited to see it complete.
Yes, I'm just excited to see the finish line come. Some of us, Adrian and myself, have worked on this since 2013, the first meeting with Transport Canada GPAC. So yeah, it'll be nice to see it finalized and be able to give some good proper guidance material to all industry to bring consistency together.
Thank you, guys. I agree 100%. I don't know what we're going to do next, though. That's, I guess, the question, right? Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is the electronic shipping documents pilot project. This is for you, Doug. You mentioned that, or actually it was mentioned at the GPAC, and we saw it on the slide from Transport Canada, that they presently have 3 rail companies, but only 2 carriers in the program at the moment. I'd love your thoughts on what you think, how important it is that we get more carriers involved, and maybe specifically Alberta carriers.
For sure. It kind of helped in a negative way. With the pandemic, there was a big push for reduction of paperwork. No one wanted to touch paper or share paper, etc. So even within the province, there was expression of interest in regards to how can we eliminate the ability to transfer documents from one person to the other. Then actually that segued into the sandbox, which was slowly being developed, and I guess this progressed. And so with only the 2 carriers, I guess it's more of also an awareness. There may not be an awareness, enough awareness, I guess, to industry and carriers for them to understand that there is an opportunity. And also, I guess, right now with the pandemic and the economics, there might not be the ability for carriers to take on that, I guess, cost associated to possibly looking at an electronic version of a shipping document. I also look at it as similar to electronic logbooks that's going to be coming in and playing in. There's some uncertainty in regards to, is there a standard that needs to be followed? No, there isn't. Is there a specific type of data set that needs to be followed? No, there isn't. Again, it's something that's new, it's fresh. If there's an IT group that has the ability to develop something that can assist with electronic shipping document, Transport Canada is fully on board with it and looking to consider it as well. Again, we would always encourage companies to get involved, reach out to Transport Canada. The bigger sample size, the better for it would be, again, to identify what may be some of the hurdles that are trying to be identified. Again, I think I mentioned before, geographical areas, even in regards to the different types of data formats. With that, and then also the types of products, and like someone mentioned or asked earlier, multiple carriers or even one carrier with multiple consignors, and how can you get about dealing with that, especially with the markings that are required on the means of containment itself. Also, I guess I'm trying to read some notes here even that I made while we were talking about this. The intent of it, again, is to help and assist with moving away from the shipping document. The only concern I have heard in the past was more with even with fire departments. Again, everyone's been programmed to think of paper documents. And now moving forward, thinking ahead in regards to there is opportunities to have this electronic document. Will there be some hiccups, some concerns? Yes, there would be. But again, it's just something that we're trying to identify here, seeing if this is something that we can move ahead with and advancement in TDG.
Excellent, thank you. Henry, any comments from you in regards to this?
Just a couple brief ones. I mean, Doug nailed most of the points there. In regards, it's always better to get a larger sampling size so we can evaluate the pros and cons of what's working, what isn't working, evaluate different systems that potential carriers and shippers are using. But again, I say a lot of this in looking at being involved with the sandbox from an informational perspective since the onset. There's issues with technology. Not everybody uses the same systems. We've been using EDI systems, electronic data interface systems, with the railways for a number of years quite successfully in the oil and gas industry. But in that retrospect, you're only traditionally dealing with two carriers, right? You're dealing with CN or CP, not to name drop, but and there's smaller short lines that they might utilize for portions of the trip, but you're really only engaging with two rail shippers. When you're dealing with carriers, as we all know within our own organizations and industry, we can be dealing with 50 different carriers and trying to get systems that are compatible with one another. Looking at adding the cost to organizations to put certain systems in place that will be compatible. I think that'll be one of the bigger hurdles to get over going down the road, is getting compatible systems amongst carriers and that. And then technology always has issues. So you have dead spots, especially in the oil and gas industry, where we load at lease sites and well sites where there's no cell coverage or Wi-Fi. So how do you get that document to the trucker on his phone or his iPad or his in-cab electronic system until he's 50 miles down the road? And what happens when something happens in between that, from the time he loads to the time something happens on road? So, I mean, those are all things we need to look at, and we need to come up with solutions on how we're going to deal with that going forward from a regulatory perspective as well as from an industry perspective.
Thank you. So I think one overarching thing that I'm hearing is we're hoping that more companies will get involved during the pilot project so that we can get a real understanding of the pitfalls and challenges to the program. Going forward, we can be really successful with that. So before I go on to the next question, I am actually going to go back to the first question in regards to training. Just as I was ending off, I got a note that Henry wanted to add a little something on the training. So I'll turn it back over to you, Henry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corinne. All I wanted to really iterate to people online is that when it comes to training, a lot of companies use third-party organizations outside of their own company to do all or a part of that training. And the new standard is going to be very clear or prescriptive, however you want to describe it, on ensuring that you're using somebody that is certified, that can validate what they're doing is accurate and correct. You know, you can't just necessarily say, oh, well, you know, I'm dealing with ABC safety and they do our WMIS and stuff like that. You're going to have to do, organizations are going to have to do some validation on those contractors they use to ensure that what they're training is compliant and it meets what the organization is going to be measured against. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that was kind of a myth in the discussion.
Great, thank you. Definitely appreciated it. We're going to go back actually now to the second question. I actually didn't answer or ask Angela a question I was curious about. And Angela, this is for you. The topic of toxicity, as you mentioned, definitely H2S and other toxic components have come up regarding crude in particular. Do you see H2S exposure as an issue we need to be strongly concerned about in reference to transportation of dangerous goods? And obviously we're talking about transportation of dangerous goods as opposed to public safety, or if you can elaborate on that, that would be great.
Thanks, Corinne. And zeroing in on the H2S is good by me. The other toxins we had to deal with through this process are predominantly BTECs. We hear about benzene, benzene, ethyltoluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. Those are chronic health hazards, and so like smoking, like asbestos, we'll see the disease in years to come, and they are important from an occupational health standpoint for a company. H2S is an acute hazard, so that has more bearing on TDG purposes. So our industry recognizes H2S exposure as a concern. We test for it in our products. We monitor for it at our work sites. We even monitor on our workers individually. There's no denying that it's an occupational hazard that requires managing, but once our product's loaded and sealed into an appropriate means of container or package, H2S represents 1% of the shipment volume, not a full shipment of H2S gas. So that's something you got to keep in mind. CAP did modeling to show that the H2S released from the scene of an accident is gone, it dissipates. And we understand this too in our industry, but within 5 minutes, it's gone. And even for the most sour crude in Canada. On top of that, we looked at TDG incidents related to H2S. And interestingly, H2S in crude is not an elevated risk for haulers, public, and the environment. That's TDG jurisdiction. So through calculations, as I talked about earlier, and sampling results, we've shown that transporting crude with H2S is as safe as it's always been. Flammability, and like the safety moment, right? Flammability is the highest hazard. And if we control for that, then we've controlled for H2S as well. So a specific UN number, like Claudette mentioned, 3494 for sour crude is unnecessary. Any crude can contain H2S, and the ERG, Emergency Response Guide for 2020, has been updated to say that. So your SDS should also call out the H2S for workers and supervisors, again in an occupational setting, and then and a product stewardship, right? Husky sets a great example using Chemscape smart charts for visual reminders of the hazards and the controls applicable to their products. And there's one thing I've learned from my Transport Canada meetings: a lot of things get blamed on training or lack thereof. And so clear and simple communication of shipping document information, like Doug mentioned, having that presented at the loadout box, giving it to the haulers in a format that they can take that information quickly, showing them the placards, the safety markings they need, the hazards and emergency procedures they required. So doing that as simply as we can and clearly reduces error and goes a long way to doing TDG right, in my experience.
Thank you so much, Angela. That is excellent. Okay, so the next question I've got goes back again to our association representatives. So another project in the works with Transport Canada is that client identification database. And I know Transport Canada has come to Calgary to put on a bit of information session for us. But I would like to know from Rob and Claudette, if there's any concerns that your members have. And this time I'll let Rob go first, and then we'll go to Claudette. So Rob, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Corinne. So yes, the CID, or Client Information Database, and I remember that Transport Canada coming to town, it was in March of 2018, meeting at the Calgary airport, and some of us on the panel and Adrian were certainly there. And we've been talking about this now for, if you think about that, it's almost 3 years. And it does take time to develop policy through all the consultations with stakeholders. I would say that probably maybe give a little bit of background. Transport Canada has been called out pretty specifically, and especially, again, we go back to Lac-Mégantic, and that was really an event, a tragic event that was the catalyst for a lot of scrutiny and the changes or updating we're seeing to TDG in Canada. And one of the notes there, and then recent findings by the Auditor General of Canada, is that Transport Canada could do a better job of having data and understanding more about the dangerous goods that move around by the different modes of transport in Canada. And that's a fair comment and criticism, if you will. And we, industry certainly supports that. Transport Canada should have that data so that they can make, they have a more complete understanding. They can make good risk-based assessments and decisions on how to shape policy or target compliance, all those sorts of things. So the information is critical. So that said, I would say we do have, some certainly industry asks that we've been giving back to Transport Canada as this consultation goes on. And I would think one of the biggest is probably around utilizing existing information versus requesting new information. Transport Canada and other branches of government have a lot of information already. Sometimes it's submitted for other purposes. It could be under NPRI, for example, or provincially. So we want to make sure that whatever's done here doesn't create duplicity or a requirement to submit information twice, if at all possible. Recognizing that that this information is going to, have specific needs, and in some cases be in a specific format, if you will. And I would say another concern maybe is around privacy and the sharing of sensitive information. So facility-specific information that shows, for instance, the kinds of dangerous goods that are at a site or quantities could be sensitive. You certainly don't want that kind of information to fall into the wrong hands. So that would be a concern. And I would finish, I guess, with making sure that any of this information that comes out, or rather is asked for of sites, is really at sites that handle, offer for transport or import products, and not others. I'll give a quick example. So the term is HOTI, HOTI. I kind of like that term that Transport Canada coined to think of where dangerous goods regulations apply and where they don't. And in Canada, there's about 12,000 service stations, and they would not be captured under this because they are end destinations. So they're not, when you go to a service station, the TDG regulations don't apply because it's a destination. Dangerous goods there aren't being transported. They're just being sold to the end user. So that's a good example. And I know Claudette can talk more about the sites where they are applicable. Certainly in the downstream, terminals and bulk plants are places where products are loaded for further distribution, and those would be captured under this proposed client information database. Anyways, I think I said enough, and I'll let Claudette go from there.
Great, thank you. Claudette, go right ahead.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that introduction. And I think from CAP agrees. I think the administrative burden of the potential asks within the client identification database are extremely heavy. It sounds like Transport Canada would like to know everything. Meanwhile, from our perspective, it's kind of like, well, what do you really need to know? We understand that Transport Canada needs the data to know who they are regulating so that they can go out and audit and inspect. So really, at the end of the day, it's really more about audit and inspection to the right regulated groups based on risk. From our perspective, we believe that the amount of data that Transport Canada is currently looking for and asking for, we do believe a lot of that data they already have, just in various other formats. So an example would be the ERAP program has a lot of information in it already from consigners that transport any dangerous goods by rail. So that's already within their data house or data warehouse. They also have a lot of information from Canutech on all the multiple products that we do have and that we ship by both road and rail. So all of that information is housed through Canutech. So there are multiple different spots and areas of databases that Transport Canada has access to and they haven't leveraged. So there's a loss of efficiency there. Right now, they're currently asking folks to potentially do the data dump ourselves. And from our perspective, that's really heavy. And there's lots of concerns about what data to provide and how much data is enough. Transport Canada would like to see, as Rob mentioned, all the work sites where dangerous goods are handled, offered for transport, transported, or imported. So that haughty piece. For a big producer like Husky, you could have over 3,000 work sites that you would need to update and input into the Transport Canada's database. And from our perspective, is to what end? You know, that's only one producer. We've got multiple producers across Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan from an upstream perspective with lots of work sites. And the administrative burden and potential to go sideways is huge. So from a policy side, we are advocating pretty heavily with Transport Canada on the process of gathering the information and trying to guide what data is really needed so that they can use the right data for their needs moving forward. And not just because it's what data do you need compared to what data do you want kind of analogy.
Thank you. I definitely agree. And as a producer, I'm definitely not looking forward to having to do another huge administrative burden. So, and also it's not only the administrative burden, but also just the clarity, right, on what exactly they want and why. Exactly what you said. Henry, as a GPAC member, is there any additional thoughts on the CID?
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. I think Rob and Claudette did a pretty good job of outlining the pros and cons. You know, there's concerns as to I'm going to always say the devil's in the details. So until we really see what this is going to look like, then we can have, I'll say, more educated talks with Transport Canada to kind of finalize the fine detail. But as has been said by both Claudette and Rob, they have so much of this data through the ERAP systems, through Canutech, through our SDS registration with them. They know our sites, they know the products we move. I have some concerns in some of the data sets that they were looking, or data points they're looking for, such as routing, volumes, and where that travels. If they're looking, do we move product from here to BC or Saskatchewan? That's one thing. If they're looking for actual routing, that's really hard for a shipper to declare that, because that's on the carrier, that's borne by the carriers, right? I don't know where rail shipments get sided and where they get reconnected to another train or get added to a different shipment going south, nor do I have control as a company where the truck carriers go, right? They pick up here, but they could take 5 different routes, Edmonton, let's say. So, you know, hopefully they're not going to get that granular, because that will become really problematic for both industry and everybody involved. And what are you going to do with that information if something occurs en route and the guy's off what he listed as his designated route? Like for some reason, he chose to take a different routing, and they're saying, well, you know, you're supposed to travel Highway 40 and you were on Highway 22. Like I don't know what they're doing with the detail. The benefit I do see is that they're going to use some of this data for their, what's the terminology they use? They're evaluating risk and inspecting companies. Maybe some of those inspections will be more freely shared with more companies and organizations in industry than right now. It's targeted to the few that they know, and we get, you know, rail inspections every year at the same facility, and you know, the facility passes and there's no issues found. Is let's focus maybe on inspecting some of the organizations that we don't know are out there shipping dangerous goods or storing dangerous goods on site.
Great, thank you very much. I think that definitely covered everything. This is the last question I've got for you guys.
Corinne?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I would love to hear from Doug, if he's still on the panel, on his perspective from a compliance and inspection with Alberta Transportation, his perspective as a regulator with regards to the client identification database.
We're not sitting in a lounge with a couple of drinks in front of me, so I can't speak freely. I apologize. Oh no, did I say that out loud? For us, again, it's being able to identify sites. I guess the main focus was, actually, can everyone hear me? I apologize, I changed.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Oh, okay, cool. Nope, focus was on heavy industrial corporate entities versus smaller entities, and I guess that's where sometimes the confusion happens. In dangerous goods, there's mom and pop can now load up dangerous goods and then transport it down the road, and no one would ever know, I guess. It's a little different than if everyone's familiar with commercial trucks and carrier profiles and national safety code, etc. There, that's a bit more, you have an identity, you have an ability to identify your carriers, etc. I guess if you want to look at it, that's what you're trying to focus on the dangerous goods realm, is identify companies, individuals that are hotties. And so for that, I see a benefit to it. But at the same time, is the amount of data that they're asking for or requesting is cumbersome, and really, and what's the benefits to it, and are you going to utilize that information as well? On the enforcement side, it's nice, at least you can catalog it and say we have a repeat offender, if you want to call it that, especially on the enforcement side, and focus and provide them some guidance even to some degree. And potentially restrict. I don't know if that's the intent of it, but again, that's a regulatory realm that we're not involved with. I apologize, I don't have more information though, but I understand the intent, but in regards to the degree and the amount of information they're requesting, I would agree with the panel itself.
Great, thank you so much. Claudette, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate that.
It does sound like we have to take Doug for a drink, though, just to get the real story behind it all. All right, so we're on our last question. This is just a reminder to any of the attendees, if you do have a question for our panelists, to get it into the chat now. We'll be doing a quick Q&A before we close out the day. So the last question is, we as an industry have done a lot of work on produced water. Residue last contained on the shipping document and utilizing the proper safety marks. This is for you, Doug. Have you seen a decrease in issues pertaining to produced water? And is this something that you think we still need to be really focused on in the field?
Funny you asked that question, because just the other day I got a report from Roadside in regards to this particular question. So funny how it all comes around. But in regards to decrease, yes, we have seen a decrease in, I guess, violations. I want to say that the awareness information that was provided via Alberta Transportation and even Transport Canada helped and assisted with that, especially with even in Alberta, we had issued the permit focuses on produced water, and then Transport Canada's bulletin or guidance document that they provided. There's still sometimes is confusion, and again, it always goes back to the training and awareness for one, the consignor, and two, the carrier and the driver that's going to then be transporting the product. For the most part, once it's understood and clear for industry groups, and I'll say that's just more focused on the carriers, it becomes a lot easier for them because they're the ones that are typically loading it, transporting it, and then offloading it. And then again, for the responders and then officers roadside in identifying what the product that's actually being transported as well. So for the shipping documents, we haven't seen too much of a concern. The two type of shipping documents, one having the residue of the crude oil, if we're going to use crude oil as the example, the shipping document, and then have the secondary shipping or document identifying the produced water that isn't regulated. I think that's helped officers and roadside, and then also with industry. Excellent. And the example that I came up with is just the other day, again, it was more driver related. Driver failed to properly document their shipping document. And again, this goes back to the training and awareness and making sure that the ones responsible understand what they're handling and then transporting.
Excellent, thank you. Does anyone want to comment on the produced water? Maybe Claudette with the CAP certificate that we're not renewing? You're muted. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Hi, thanks, Corinne. Yes, so CAP is not renewing its certificate through Alberta Transportation, and this is in response to the clarity that has been provided by Transport Canada through their bulletin on produced water. So I agree with Doug. I think it's added a lot of clarity, and from a training and awareness perspective for drivers, I think it does go a long way of increasing the compliance level of folks transporting produced water out there, which is a great thing to see. I think looking forward, Transport Canada still has some potential issues with produced water. The majority of produced water isn't regulated as a dangerous good because it doesn't meet the criteria of a dangerous good. So it's not regulated under the Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulation. Transport Canada is really looking hard at produced water and trying to understand more of the characteristics and potential impacts of transport of produced water. So they have done an internal risk assessment on produced water. It's something that they haven't shared with industry. So I just know that they've done it, but I don't know the results of that. It's something that they are kind of holding on to at the moment, but I believe once we tie up a little bit of the loose ends on the crude oil classification, I do believe the produced water piece may come to the forefront from a classification perspective or a focus with Transport Canada is my suspicion. So don't be shocked if more regulation or a little bit of spotlight comes onto produced water in the near future.
Excellent, thank you so much. Does anyone else from the panel have anything about produced water, or can I go on to the next?
I guess a question, Corinne, and guess more so to Doug. Like in past, the issue around produced water really sparked or stemmed from a number of various incidents over the years related to repair shops and maintenance shops where the tank was either not purged or steamed out properly, or not placards had been removed because they run a load of water through there and didn't realize there were issues with the residual vapors in the tank. But predominantly on the road, there haven't been, at least my past experience in 30 plus years of dealing with safety and response and that on the road, there haven't been a lot of on-road issues where there's been risk or danger to firefighters because of produced water, treating it as a load of water and the tank catches on fire. I think predominantly most of those issues, and correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, most of those issues that I've seen or read about in safety alerts and that have all stemmed around improperly steam purged or placarded tanks when they go into a shop.
Correct. Yep. Majority of those incidences are a result of the facilities themselves that have performed hot work on tanks that were properly purged and cleaned, but also to comment about no incidences that have been notified, I guess, roadside. I want to say it's also probably to reflect that also first responders are being responsible if they've identified that there is a vehicle or a tank in particular that either still has placards or potentially has hazardous material on board, is then what steps they take in regards to the recovery of that of the vehicle itself. And so not actually taking a sawzall to the tank or something that would require sparking, for example. So knock on wood, don't want it to happen, don't want to see or hear a report of that, but that's also, I guess, one of the benefits of addressing or identifying that even though it's a non-regulated product, but we'll call it a dirty tank, a residue tank, still identifying with placards. So then at an incident, they are aware of that, and then precautions can be taken versus just going in blind and saying, oh, we're careful here, this is a milk tank, and we're good to go. We don't have to worry about this. It's only produced water, for example.
Thanks, Doug.
Great. So I am watching the questions and I don't see any coming through, but I actually wanted to know, Henry, you guys have a really robust TDG evaluation program at your company. But I was wondering if you could give us maybe just a little bit of, a synopsis of, why it's so important to have that that TDG evaluation program.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne, for that question. I spoke on this last year at the Banff Petroleum Safety Conference as well on I called it bridging the gaps. It's finding out, people think they're in compliance, but they really have no way of measuring it. And I think it's important that internally organizations look, whether that's part of their regulatory program or their safety program in-house, but they have a bigger scope or a bigger scope around the importance of TDG, because especially in oil and gas, and I'll say, Canadian Fuels Association as well, pretty much everything we do has a dangerous goods component to it. All our products are dangerous goods regulated, regardless of what they are traditionally. But what I find is I've done a lot of auditing over 30 years in safety, and you go into companies and they say, oh, we're compliant with TDG. Yeah, our people have to be trained. And they kind of have the bare minimum requirements in place of, yeah, we have a certificate, but they can't really walk you through their program. There's nobody really that understands the in-house, the regulatory aspects of all the different pieces of dangerous goods. So I think it's really important that companies treat dangerous goods as any other program, whether that be ground disturbance or WMIS or safety, different safety programs in their company, and treat dangerous goods in the same aspect of building programs so that people know what the expectations are of them internally and as required by regulations, and then you measure that on an annual basis. Like we have a 3-year program at Kira where I audit all of our facilities across North America, throughout a 3-year period. So I do a third of the facilities this year, I do a third of the facilities next year. And then in that way, if you identify the TDG, use the regulations as, what are the kind of the questions I need to ask or things to look for, it's easy to build an audit tool for your organization and then measure against it, right? And find out where those gaps are, because lots of times the gaps are quite easy to fill in or fix. But if you don't check on them and you don't measure them and you don't identify them, you really don't know what to fix within your organization. That was one of the first things that I was asked to do when I came to Kira is, what do we need to fix? Where aren't we compliant? And we have to build a measurement tool, first of all, to analyze that. And then once we have a baseline done on what some of the issues are, then we can go forward and look at putting the right corrective measures in place to fix those things.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Henry. That's absolutely appreciated. So I don't see any new questions in the question chat, so I'll just quickly go around the table to see if there's any last comments. Doug from Alberta TDG, any final comments?
No, nothing for me. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. And
thank you for coming.
Wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Excellent. You too. Claudette from CAP, any final comments?
I'm going to echo Doug's same sentiment. So thank you for having me. I hope I was a value-added addition to the panel. You've got some great folks here and present, and I hope that we added some value to everyone that has attended. I do say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone as well, and look forward in 2021 to CAP's new guide for the classification of crude oil and related products by road and rail being published. So thank you.
Thank you. Rob Hoffman from the Canadian Fuels Association, anything you'd like to add to the end?
Again, thanks Corinne and Husky for hosting this. I know the last few years you've done it live in person, but the nice thing about the virtual forum is it made it easy for people to join from places outside of Calgary, so that was good. And I know a number of Canadian Fuels members joined, and I really appreciate them doing that. And Claudette and Henry and Doug and Angela, my fellow panelists, I thought that was a great discussion, so thanks very much. And yes, Claudette, it was very much value add, and so that was it was fun to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Henry Ritters, representing the GPAC, any final words?
Yeah, no, I just want to echo what everybody said. I really thank Husky and yourself for inviting us to participate and pulling this together. I know I've participated in one of your in-house, I think your first one actually as a panelist as well. No, I think they're good discussions. I think these forums are value added. I would like to personally see it grow with Transport Canada into a wider audience type participation, because we have not had a good any form of TDG symposium in Canada for many years, and it would be good to see, hopefully one day we'll all go back to being in the normal zone again, and we can intermingle in person versus online. But I thought Husky did a bang-up job of this presentation and the interaction with speakers and presentations and guests. So I'd like to see it grow, and I would help support Husky in any way to get this to the Transport Canada table to grow it. And other than that, I just wish everybody a Merry Christmas and that everybody stays healthy into the new year, and thank God that 2020 is almost gone.
I definitely echo that. Angela Wheeler from Chemscape, any final words from you?
No one should ever have to go behind Henry. He left nothing unsaid. So I ditto. It's been a great experience. Thanks so much for including me. Season's greetings and stay well.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, everyone. I think that's a wrap. We're going to end a little bit early, so people are getting 15 minutes of their day back, and I know that's always appreciated. But definitely I appreciate everyone's time and support in everything TDG. I'd like to thank our presenters, our panelists for participating, our viewers for their attention, our AV team for making this happen. I really do appreciate all the cooperation I received and that we could make this a go. It's exciting, and I echo Henry in saying I'd love to see it grow. I'd love to see it grow. I'd love to see more people involved, and I definitely would love to have it face to face where we can have these discussions. So thank you to everyone, and I wish everyone a very Merry Christmas.
Thanks.